Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Buzzanco and Scott Parkin.
Hey everybody, welcome to our panel on media in the age of Is that on? War and resistance. And we're going to get started. All right. My name is Scott Parkin. Hey, I'm the co-host of the Green and Red podcast, and I do a lot of local organizing with groups like Mount Diablo Rising Tide and Rainforest Action Network and Oil and Gas Action Network. And to kind of kick off the evening, we're going to have Phoebe Thomas Sorgan, who's with the Berkeley Fellowship of Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Committee, who's been actually helping us out with this event as a co-host of this event. Say a few things. And Rainforest Action Network and Oil and Gas Action Network. And to kind of kick off the evening, we're going to have Phoebe.
Hello. Welcome, everybody, to the Berkeley Fellowship of UUs. And I want to invite you to come back many times. Every Sunday morning at 10:30, we have inspiring services that are eclectic and that change a lot. We have rotating speakers. This Sunday, I believe it's Reverend Gail Asali, who is a former Black Panther, who then became an artist, painter, and then became a minister. And so do come on Sunday mornings. We're interfaith. She's kind of Christian, but most of us aren't. We have atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, everybody who's kind of like progressive and not dogmatic. And you can see from our banners in back, pagans too. Yeah, there's a naked lady up there. I'm a pagan. So tomorrow night we have our monthly open mic here. And the open mics tend to have a lot of peace and justice type folk music because our open mics were founded by Country Joe McDonald. But everything's welcome. We sometimes have magic, comedy, storytelling, poetry, and come at 6:30 if you want to sign up for a 5-minute slot, or just come at 7 if you want to see the show from 7 to 9. Our featured artist tomorrow night is Nancy Lemon, who is one of the leading experts nationally on domestic violence and the law, and she also happens to be a singer. And we're hosted tomorrow night by Marcy Boyd, who is with Acapella. Join Acapella Saturday if you don't want to or can't march in the Mission Saturday. Join us at the 16th Street BART station at 12:15 and sing along. We're going to be singing to the marchers. It's going to be a lot of fun on Saturday. And of course, there's a big march Sunday at 1 o'clock, starting at Civic Center in San Francisco, and lots of marches on MLK Day always. We are going to Oakland as usual, the Anti-Police Terror Project and others. And the Oakland UUs are meeting at their church, which is 4 blocks from Oscar Grant Plaza. They're meeting there at 10:30 and walking together to the plaza. And some of us are meeting at the children's activity area just before 11, just before the march starts on Monday. So lots happening. And January 25th, we've got a peace gathering here with Code Pink and others, and that will be fabulous. It's a Saturday night at 7, is it, Cynthia? 7 o'clock. There'll be live music and homemade pie. If you have ever tasted Cynthia Papermaster's pies, then that will be a draw, if nothing else, but it'll be a fabulous evening. So lots happening, and very welcome here. So glad we're honored to have this event here. And Scott will come and introduce the speakers, who need no introduction, but.
Yeah, and before I introduce the speakers, I just want to say that I want to say thanks to actually everyone who came out tonight, and I want to say thanks to the church, the BFUU, for allowing us to do this and co-hosting this with us. I also want to thank the crew of folks who've been helping me organize this. You know, everyone who helped do setup, to our AV crew, to people working the door and stuff like that. And then this is co-hosted by the Green and Red podcast, Aid and Abet Logistics, the BFUU Social Justice Committee, Oil and Gas Action Network, and Mount Diablo Rising Tide. So I just want to do a big shout out to all those folks who helped us do stuff. And then, yeah. And if you're not familiar with the Green and Red podcast, since we organized them, give us a little pitch. We're a scrappy people's history and politics podcast. We put out shows anywhere from every 3 to 10 days. We do it in our volunteer time. It's mostly myself and one of the panelists, Bob Buzzanco. Go to greenandredpodcast.org to check us out if you want to follow us. And this is our first live event as the Green and Red podcast, so we're pretty excited about it. And to get on with the introductions, tonight's panel is Media in the Time of War and Resistance. We thought that was going to be a very apropos sort of theme for the evening. You know, there's a lot of current events going on right now, everything from this supposed ceasefire in Gaza to the inauguration of Trump next week, to many other things, the Los Angeles fires and all of that. And so we really actually are going to talk about a couple of different things, but the real important part that we really wanted to emphasize is that, you know, with independent media, with shows like Electronic Intifada and Flashpoints and Green and Red podcasts and many more, is that they're actually telling the stories that, you know, you aren't hearing in the corporate media. We're actually seeing a lot of people in the corporate media really capitulating to Trump and the far right in the moment. And so I just want to sort of say that'll be a little bit of a theme for the evening, but we're going to talk about a couple of different things. And to introduce our panelists, I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak tonight. First is my co-host, Professor Robert Buzzanco, who's a professor at the University of Houston. He's the award-winning author of The Masters of War, Vietnam and the Transformation of American Life. As part of his activist and scholarly engagement, Bob was advisor and interviewer of Noam Chomsky on Masterclass last year, which actually was one of the last sort of public appearances by Noam Chomsky before he dropped out of public life. And then we're also joined by Dennis Bernstein, who is the co-host of KPFA's Flashpoints. He's a poet and human rights reporter. He's author of Notebook 19, 5 Oceans in a Teaspoon, and Special Ed, Voices from a Hidden Classroom. And then we're also joined by Nora Barrows-Friedman, who's the associate editor of Electronic Intifada, co-host of the weekly EI Livestream. She's been reporting on Palestine for more than 20 years and worked with Dennis at Flashpoints from 2003 to 2010. So I just want to extend a warm welcome, an exciting welcome to our panelists. And with that, I will hand it off to Bob.
I'm going to stand up because I'm a professor and I don't know how to talk when I'm sitting down, but you don't have to. Oh, I can. Okay. Oh wow, look at that. I feel like I'm Sinatra or something like that. Be realistic, demand the impossible. You've probably heard that. That was one of the main slogans in Paris in 1968. And I think it's kind of appropriate today because we are facing things that I think it's fair to say we probably haven't seen before. And when Scott and I put this together, we had certain ideas, but this was a while ago, and events have changed since then. So I'm not really sure what needs to be said or what we need to hear. So I'm going to wing it. I am a professor of history, and I teach classes in U.S. foreign policy. So I know a little bit about the United States and the Middle East, but I also teach classes in the history of protest and radicalism in the United States, and maybe I know a little bit about that. I'm not even sure. So I'm trying to think. I keep thinking, like, what can we learn from what we've done? And I know I'm not supposed to say this as a historian, but I'm not sure there's a whole lot. I'm kind of stumped myself because a lot of those old things that we've relied on, the old strategies and the old solutions and the old actions, aren't really working right now, and I think we need some kind of new thinking because we really are facing something that we haven't seen before. And to some extent, I think events like this, the main purpose may be that we're looking around and seeing other people who have similar, if not the same, concerns with us. And, so where do we go? I mean, one thing I try to do is look for the ways that people acted in the past. We do have a rich history of resistance in the United States, right? And there are times which were as bad or worse than what we're going through now. I think of, World War I with the Red Scare, where 6,000 people who were alleged to be radicals were deported. The 1930s, the organizing drives of the 1930s in places like Youngstown, Ohio, where one of my good friends from Ohio is here tonight, where we grew up. Youngstown and Pittsburgh and places like that, Chicago, were the sites of major industrial battles, or of course the civil rights movement, right? And so, those are all inspirational, and I think there are modes of organizations there. But one thing that I think is difficult and we have to reckon with is that, one of the key elements, especially in the civil rights movement, was that they were trying to appeal to people's conscience. They were trying to show the world what was happening. They wanted the world to see Bull Connor beating people up. They wanted the world to see what was happening in Selma and places like that. Well, we're now dealing with a world that doesn't really have a conscience. And, we've seen that repeatedly in the summer of 2020 and last spring in the campuses of the United States. So appealing to people's moral center to get them to stop to do these kinds of repressive and horrible things probably isn't gonna work the way it used to, And so we have to figure out what way to get through, right? Strategically and tactically. And my own impression of the left as somebody who's been around for a bit is we often don't think strategically and tactically. And I'm not sure I have answers to that, but I think we really kind of have to start thinking in new ways, right? And just today, I've been kind of going through my head about what they're saying. I don't know why, but the name Hugh Thompson came to mind. And I suspect there must be some of you here who know who Hugh Thompson is, right? I'm sure Graham does, and I have, right? Hugh Thompson was a warrant officer who was in a helicopter flying above a village named My Lai in March of 1968. And he saw something horrific. He saw these ditches with people lying in the ditches and people lined up and children and women. And he forced the helicopter down. And he put it in between American forces and these Vietnamese villagers who were about to be killed. And as we know, the unit was commanded by William Calley, Lieutenant William Calley, who died last year. And Hugh Thompson and Calley had a confrontation on the ground. And Calley outranked him. He's, basically, what are you doing? And he said, what are you doing? And Hugh Thompson, to cut to the quick, basically ended that massacre. Now, hundreds of people are already killed. Hugh Thompson initially got in trouble for it, right? They covered up what Calley had done, and Hugh Thompson was seen as the villain in this, right? And it went through the chain of command, including people like Colin Powell covered it all up until a year later when people, Ron Ridenour and Seymour Hersh broke the story, right? But Hugh Thompson is really who we need, right? We need to be Hugh Thompson. And that's easy to say, right? But, Hugh Thompson put, he could have been shot by his own troops in that moment. And he certainly suffered from it and, eventually was redeemed, right? But there was no certainty of that at the time because a lot of people who engaged in those types of activities never were called into account, right? But Hugh Thompson did that because it was the right thing to do. And I kind of think that's where we are. And we're gonna have to make some hard decisions. And, we've seen, again, in the summer of 2020 or last spring on campuses, what we might face if we do that. And so I keep thinking about like an analog of this. And, so I decided to go back and rely on something that I know very well, which is the Vietnam War, because it's what I study. And I think of the Vietnam anti-war movement. And when the Vietnam anti-war movement started, it was pretty sparse, right? Nobody really knew where Vietnam was. And, nobody was really sure what was going on there. And inside the United States, Kennedy was president and it was this heroic era and things were good. And we had the civil rights movement and the war on poverty. And it seemed like, the possibilities were limitless, and we were headed toward, this really great age, based, in the United States. In the Cold War was a country with great prosperity and great global power, right? And so when the Vietnam War happened, it was hard to get people all that concerned about it. It's this country far away, And so, the first move, actions they had in the 60s, you might get 10, 20,000 people out. I remember Noam Chomsky saying that the first time they had a meeting in Cambridge, like 10 people showed up. I think it was at a Unitarian church, in fact, right? So, and nobody seemed to care. But we know what happened after that, right? It took time, but we know what happened. The Vietnam movement the anti-war movement became very potent, very powerful, right? Hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people participating in these actions. But it took time. Now, compared to that, there's reason to be kind of sanguine about the world right now. because we've seen in many cases, but especially since October 7, 2023, inside the United States, huge numbers of people have participated in resistance to this, right? They made the kind of decision that Hugh Thompson made, especially on college campuses last spring, where people were beaten and attacked and gassed and flashbanged and everything else. And it wasn't easy. But in the Vietnam era, what we saw finally was an appeal, not just to the moral conscience of America, but very practical appeals. The links between the Vietnam War and the civil rights era, right, in Vietnam obviously made it harder to put, from 1960 through 1964, when Americans were asked what the most important issue facing the country was, they said civil rights. In 1965, 66, it became Vietnam, right? And so it was hard to get people involved in that, but through publicity, through moral suasion, and through media, things like the Electronic Intifada and Flashpoints, right? Finally, people got this message. They broke through. Now, at the time, even the mainstream media, people like the New York Times, which had Neil Sheehan and David Halberstam and others, finally saw the light. We're not seeing that right now, right? But through a combination of people in the streets, people raising their voices, a sanctuary movement that offered refuge to young men who didn't want to go to the draft, didn't want to join the military, didn't want to go to Canada, right? You had a significant draft movement, right? An anti-draft movement led by people like David Harris and others, right? Often centered in churches and civic institutions like that, right? And people started to break through, and then you had this independent media, and then you had, very importantly, groups like the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. People who had been in Vietnam, fought in Vietnam, and came back to talk about it. And they became a very powerful and potent force, right? And today we have veterans groups who are doing that as well. So even, as a war that was virtually unknown, where horrible things were happening, I mean, there are great parallels between Gaza and Vietnam. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but there certainly are parallels, including the very incredible resistance of the local people there, the Viet Cong in that particular case, and the people of Gaza right now, which the media doesn't really cover. You would think that Israel hasn't suffered anything in this particular war, hasn't lost anything in this particular war, and that's simply not true. The U.S. media isn't talking about it, right? And so to have people who were involved in that, right, come back and talk about it is really important, and VVAW was really important in the 70s, right? The support that the people of the world gave to these movements, and we're seeing that today. Most people in the world, and I think most Americans don't understand this, most people in the world support Palestine, right? The big governments of Europe don't, except for Ireland and Spain, right? But most people do. And so we are, in that regard, right here, we feel isolated and we feel minimized. And we are, let's be real. I mean, one of the things that people don't like to hear is I say, we usually lose. And I'm not happy to say that, but unfortunately, we usually lose, right? But that doesn't mean we just have to accept it. We're not the Washington Generals. That would be the Democratic Party, right? There are things we can do. Now, what would that be? I'm not sure that the parallels to Vietnam are strong enough to say we can do this. But clearly, the ideas are there. And I think, when I think of, even more importantly, like the 1980s anti-intervention movement in Central America, and I was, that kind of was, I kind of cut my teeth politically on that. I was involved in that. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. And, that was really, actually pretty successful. But also, as a side note, there were actually people in the Democratic Party who had a little bit of courage and sense and joined in that and made it easier, right? Without that, and even in the 1960s, you had influential people in the ruling class, like William Fulbright, right? Or the U.S. military, which is the basis of the book that Scott mentioned, right? So you had significant members of the ruling class who said, hey, this might not be a good idea. I think we actually have some of that today. We might not know about it, but I suspect we do. And I think that's important as well, right? So there are these forces out there that I think we can call on using some of these lessons and legacies that we knew about before, right? Because, no two historical parallels are precise. But what I know about the Vietnam War, both the resistance of the Vietnamese people, the way that the United States empire inflicted pain and destruction upon Vietnam, which is still evident today, and what we're seeing in Gaza with this incredible long resistance. I mean, the Vietnamese have a huge, millennia-long history of resistance. Well, so do the people of Palestine. It may not be as long, but it's very similar, at least, it's just even if you take it from the Nakba onward, right? So, I think first of all, we have to kind of place them in front of everything because they're the people who are actually providing the resistance. But I think what we do is really important. And, the poll came out, was it yesterday or the day before, which you've probably seen, which essentially showed what we've been saying all along, which was that the Democrats' support of Gaza probably cost Harris the election. And to that, I think what we should say is, yes, it did. We should take credit for it. And we should remind them, we did it, we'll do it again. That doesn't mean you like Trump, obviously, right? But, we do have issues that we can pursue. And so I think that's important as well. I think organizing, and it starts in groups like this. I mean, if Noam had 10 at the Unitarian Church in Cambridge in 1961, we have a lot more than that here tonight, right? That's good, right? At the time, there wasn't that much media at Ramparts Magazine, alternative media, but now we have people like Dennis and Nora, right? That's important. It doesn't mean we're going to win and it's going to be easy. We have each other. That's the most important part of it. It sounds corny and cheesy, but that's what we do on the left, right? I still get teary when I hear the International, and Dennis was talking about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade earlier, and I get choked up just thinking about it, right? And there are people now doing things like that in Rehovot and places like that. Things can be done, right? I don't want to go on a big, long rant because I'd rather hear these two, frankly. But I do want to kind of segue out by bringing up somebody who was very close to me, Stoughton and Alice Lind. You're probably familiar with them. Stoughton and Alice lived in a small town in Ohio, which I actually came from, and I go back to, and I have a house there. So for the last 7 or 8 years of Stoughton's life, I spent a lot of time whenever I was in Ohio going over there and visiting Stoughton and Alice. And I think may have been Stoughton's final book was called Accompanying. And he talked about this a lot, something I hadn't heard of. Stoughton is a very, very devout Quaker, which informed his both scholarly work and his activism as much as studying Marx or history or anything else. Just an amazing person. And by accompanying or accompaniment, you can use either one, right? Stoughton said, what you can do is, we don't have the power to go in and change this by ourselves, right? We don't have the power to do that. We don't have positions, we don't have affluence, we don't have wealth or anything like that, right? But there are people who are on the front lines, like the people of Gaza today, or the people in Nicaragua in the 1980s, or the people in Vietnam, or whatever, right? Because Stoughton was a big part of all of that. But we can do what we can. We can accompany them on their journey. We can accompany them in their struggle. And, I thought that was really beautiful. And that comes to Stoughton from I think, the Quaker tradition as much as anything else. You don't let people go into battle alone. And, I think if the right wing can do that, if they can send out the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, then we can do that too. And, let's be real. I mean, we're going to see that in the next, starting next week probably, and certainly thereafter. I don't want to get into all kinds of parallels about Nazi Germany or this or that, right? And I don't think that stuff like that's going to, but what I do think we're going to see is these kind of paramilitaries, I call them, these right-wing groups that Trump instigates going out there. We're going to have to deal with that, and we're going to have to figure out ahead of time what we're going to do. Are we going to stay away? Are we going to capitulate? And I'm not trying to I don't mean that in a macho way, like, no. So everybody has a decision to make, and it's not an easy decision. I don't want to get my head broken in. I'm old, But there's something we have to, but we have to figure out there's some way to accompany people. There are a lot of ways to accompany people. And, Stoughton would talk about this a lot, and he would always put it, Stoughton had been in Palestine many times. He'd been in Vietnam. He lost his job because he went to Vietnam. He'd been active in the Central American movement. He'd been in Nicaragua. And, people like Chomsky would say the same thing, right? And, I remember, Noam one time was saying, he kind of gave a very bleak appraisal of whatever it was he was talking about. But then he ended it on a high note with hope. And I said, do you really believe that? He said, but you can't, you have to tell people that. You can't leave them with no hope. What's the point, right? And, I think too often on the left, we kind of operate in the doldrums, right? They're doing this to us and they're doing that. That's all true. And it's horrible. And it's right. But, we also have to be able to say, hey, look what we did to Kamala Harris's campaign. I don't have any problem with saying that. I'm willing to take credit for it if you want to give it to me, So I think, we have to figure out ways, and it can be a personal decision. We can work together. And the fact that we're here tonight shows that we believe in a community. And as lefties, what do we have, right? We don't have power. We don't have a lot of guns. We don't believe in that, right? We don't have wealth. We don't own banks. We're not Jamie Dimon. We're not the kind of people that Scott has to go up against in his, day job as an environmental activist, the oil companies and people like that. We can't compete with them, right? What do we have? We have a lot of people. And I think I'm loath to bring this name up because it invokes these. I don't know if you've ever seen the Woody Allen movie Zelig, where Zelig, it means something to everybody. He's something different to everybody. Well, Luigi Mangione is, I think, our Zelig today, right? And I'm certainly not in any way condoning or suggesting you go out and do things like that. But I think what is important, setting aside the act, is the response to it. That's not a left-right act. That is an up and down act. There are people, that 99% of people, you don't have to prove it, but they say, I understand. I understand that anger. I understand that vehemence. And I understand that people could break because it's so painful, right? And you have to do something about it, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with instilling a little bit of intimidation in the ruling class, a little bit of fear. Not violence, but fear. Letting them know. I mean, Kamala Harris didn't do it. We tried to tell her. She didn't listen, right? And I think we need to keep doing that. Look what we did. One of the things that I always catch flack for, in 2000, after the election, how everybody blamed Ralph Nader. If I were Ralph Nader, I would have said, yep, I did it, and I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to keep doing it. I don't think there's anything wrong with a little bit of, kind of bravado there. It's not about, look how far it's gotten Trump. This guy's profoundly stupid, but, he's full of bluster and bravado, and people buy it, right? I think we need to find ways, it's, in our hearts, in our minds, to accompany each other, to accompany people in Gaza and wherever else. And there's plenty of places right now. Cuba is probably under attack. Biden lifts the sanctions, didn't lift the sanctions. He took them off the terror list 6 days before he leaves office, which means that, next Tuesday it'll be back on the terror list, right? And that's painful. I've been there, and the place means a lot to me, right? And I fear for the worst. So we got a lot of work on our hands, right? And so I want to finish with something from one of the most important people I've ever come across, never met, but come across. And it's very appropriate, I think, also because of the space we're in December of 1964, I think you know where I'm going with this, at Spruill Hall, right? There comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And we have to throw our bodies upon the gears, upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and tell the people who own the machine, indicate to the people who run the machine, who own the machine, that business will no longer take place as usual, right? And we have to put our bodies somehow, we have to accompany these people and somehow put our bodies upon the machine, right? And I can't wait to hear what Dennis and Nora have to say, because I think that's really, more important. We're living in a perilous world with a lot of stuff happening, especially in the last 48 hours. So thank you again for coming out. It means a lot. And just being in a room like this, it means a lot to me, because, it's easy to feel alone. And, being in here with a lot of other people is really important. So thank you. And I believe Dennis is next.
Are we on? Yes? I'm going to remain seated. Hello, everybody. How are you doing? You all right? I'm not really all right. I'm troubled. I'm inspired. I'm troubled, of course, because we have all, anyway, those of us who have our eyes open, have been witnessing an extraordinarily violent thing, a genocide, an expanding genocide, funded by this country, and the violence is absolutely unbelievable. Nora's going to talk to you more about all of this. But I can tell you that I started out work in this world as a teacher of very young children. They always wanted to put the men with the older kids, the 6th graders. But I adored teaching the very young children. I was a kindergarten teacher and a 1st grade teacher. And it was beautiful to watch the kids and see them evolving. I mean, down to the development of the fine muscles in their arms and legs. Beautiful. And they'd say the most amazing things to me. I taught in the poorest neighborhood in New York City, arguably South Bronx. But I just listened and was constantly amazed. It is, this notion, this idea that just certain things that, like wake me up in the middle of the night, like the idea that we accepted when it's reporting on Gaza, that it's okay to do, if there happens to be a surviving living doctor, it's okay to do operations without anesthesia. It's become normal. Anybody in here think they could bear that? It's incredibly troubling. Now, it's also extraordinarily inspiring that Palestinians have been able to restrain, stand up, stay whole in the greatest sense of the word, in their belief, in their vision. I don't know, Nora knows more about this than me, but I think there's more resistance now than there was 2 years ago. And there's lots more volunteers. Is that real? So I'm sick to my stomach about this shredding of children and doctors and journalists. And I'm amazed that this community, this Palestinian community, is standing up. What else could the US and Israel throw at them? I'm also absolutely beside myself, you could say, about the practiced silence, the knowing silence, the active participation in the suppression of information that's being carried forth by a corporate press that has now learned what to do. I'm reminded of the story. Nicholas Johnson, I think his name, former FCC Commissioner Nick Johnson. I was interviewing him and he told the story. He was most concerned not about government censorship, but about individual censorship, self-censorship, corporate censorship. And he told this little story about this young reporter, just gets the job, is excited to go, investigative reporter is excited to go out there and really see something and do something. And he sees this river being polluted by this corporation, and he nails down the story, and he interviews the people who are suffering downstream and all the whole thing. And he's got an amazing story, and he goes back, shows it to his editor. His editor reads it, loves it, says, we can't publish this. This factory, that's our main advertiser. We can't do this story. Now, he goes out again, this young reporter, and he sees another amazing story. He does document it. He writes it down, gets it right, interviews all the people, goes back to the paper. He's just about to go into the editor's office, and he thinks, he's probably not interested. And the third time the reporter goes out, doesn't see the story. It's self-censorship. It's the knowing silence. They are participants in this genocide. They are active. By being passive, they are active participants in this genocide. And I am very troubled. This war machine is scaring the hell out of me. I'm inspired by the resistance, but I'm incredibly worried. I know you all are, as we are heading into the age of Trump. I'd like, if I could, just to take a few personal minutes before I turn it over to Nora, and just try and say a little bit about, somehow how I got to this place of being this kind of journalist and reporting on all the issues that have to do with the uncontrolled distribution of amazing weaponry of mass destruction. I just was recently it would have been my dad's, I think, 94th birthday or something. And he was like a war hero. 3 Bronze Stars, a machine gunner in Patton's military. He was considered a war hero of the time. And he hated war. I asked him once what he would do if he ran into General Patton in the 5 and 10. He said he'd punch the shit out of him. And my father grew to really hate war, and the way he talked about, we were just a bunch of young kids killing each other. We were sent out there, government sent us out there to kill each other, and you could hear them crying for their mothers. So one day I was out trying to catch bees in a jar, and I got stung, and I was angry. I think I was about 11. And I went back to the house, and we had a big can of Raid. You remember those big orange cans? And I was going to declare war on the kingdom of the bee. And my father sort of catches me on the way out. He says, where are you going with that can of Raid in your hand? I said, this bee stung me. I'm going to kill these bees. He says, you're going to kill these bees? He says, did I ever tell you the story of the bee that saved my life? And I said, no. He says, hey, let me tell you, one day I'm out there and we're in the war zone and we're taking a break, and about 8 of us are sitting around having our lunch when this bee started to buzz all around my head. And so I'm a city kid. I didn't like bees. I went up and moved behind a tree. He said, about 11 seconds later, a large mortar shell landed where I was sitting and killed my 8 buddies. And so I don't think it's a good idea to go out there and attack those bees. I sort of think of it as be on a rescue mission. So then we just went inside, had some tea, and of course, we had some honey. Anyway, I'm praying for peace. Thank you all.
Well, the kind of journalist that you became let me become the kind of journalist I am. And I am forever indebted and a little bit annoyed.
Yeah.
Pissed off sometimes in the most bleakest moments. Why did Dennis do this to me? But no, it's an honor, and
I'm proud. But really, Barbara Lubin has something to say about this too.
That's true. It's you and Barbara Lubin pushed me into this world. I don't know what to say. I mean, I spend my days every day without a break for the last 16 months, scrolling the news from my friends from overnight. I'm actually just now, I got a text from a friend in Gaza letting me know that she's alive. This is like our daily routine for a long time. At the very beginning of the genocide, I was checking in a lot with one of my dearest friends, and on December 6th, I didn't get a text back from him, and he was killed. It's Rifat al-Rir, who I'm sure many of you know about Rifat. He was our friend and our colleague and a contributor to the Electronic Intifada for a long, long time. He was an incredible poet. His poem has been translated into hundreds of languages after he was killed, and you see them on placards and T-shirts and kites now, whenever there's a Gaza protest. And so it's been this routine of checking the news, documenting the atrocities, checking in with my friends, making sure that my sources are correct for a certain, news item, and double checking, and it becomes kind of this weird, this very strange cycle where I'm so immersed in what's happening in Gaza, and yet I'm also very, sometimes I feel just incredibly numb because I have to be. And I know some people who watch the live stream are like, what's Nora's secret? Why isn't she breaking down in tears every day? I actually haven't cried yet this whole time. There's been a little here and there. Yeah. I've choked up at certain times, but I haven't let it go, because if I do, I think I won't stop.
I cry and then I feel guilty.
Yeah.
So what the fuck are you crying?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think that's probably it. I've been trying to figure this out. My therapist has been trying to figure this out. It's like
get out.
It's a mystery.
Go outside and do something.
Exactly. And so it's this very strange, and now that it looks like the ceasefire is going to take place by the time we all wake up on Sunday. It'll be in place. And I think about the sounds and the smells and the way that the sunset will look for my friends and colleagues when those drones stop, right? That for the last, not just 15 months, but for the last 25 years, they've had aerial surveillance vehicles, surveilling every single part of Gaza. And for the last 15 months in particular, they've accelerated this surveillance. And it's not just surveillance, which is evil in and of itself, but it is psychological torture, right? Because these drones, either they're surveillance drones and they make these noises and they tune them to certain pitches so that if you have two drones, they're each they're like half a note off. So it's this insane torture. Dissonance, this noise torture that people are just living with. They're not inured to it because it's disgusting and despicable, but they have to live with it in order to just survive. And so I'm looking forward to Sunday when those drones are supposed to stop, at least I think for 12 hours, which again, we're just it's not enough, but it's something, right? The ceasefire itself is not enough, but it's something. I think about the smells, because people that we know and love in Gaza say that every single inch of Gaza smells like death. People know the smell of blood before they can see blood. The smell, when people are eventually allowed to go back to the north where they've been expelled from over the last, especially 100 days, Israel has decimated every single square inch of North Gaza, Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, Jabalia, north of Gaza City. And the remnants of war crimes that are going to be uncovered is going to be unmeasurable, immeasurable, unspeakable. And I think about the visuals, the air, the smell of people cooking once again when trucks are, hopefully going to be let in, which is also part of the first phase of this ceasefire process, where, before the genocide began, there were 500 trucks per day that were allowed by the occupier into the Gaza Strip. And those trucks were heavily restricted. There were something like, I can't even remember how many, now the numbers just kind of like all messed together in my head, but there were hundreds of items on the banned list because they were categorized as dual use, right? So fertilizer, for example, for people's farms was considered a dual use item because it could be somehow, if Hamas or the other armed resistance groups got a hold of fertilizer, they could turn it into, a weapon. But then how do you explain diapers? How do you explain menstrual pads? How do you explain chemotherapy medications? How do you explain bandages? How do you explain musical instruments? How do you explain art supplies and math textbooks? When I went to Gaza the first time was in 2005, and I remember reporting on the phone to you, Dennis, right after I got back from visiting a pharmacy at a hospital in Gaza City. And again, this was 2005. And the siege hadn't even been enacted yet, right? So this was even before the 17. And I remember going into a hospital pharmacy, and the pharmacist was showing me the stocks of anesthesia medications, and they were low. They were low. And then the siege started. And then for the next 17 years, we at the Electronic Intifada and at Flashpoints reported on just the sadistic nature of Israel's intensified siege on Gaza, where these items, these dialysis machines and CAT scan machines and anesthetics and even sometimes like basic items like Tylenol and antibiotics were dwindling or sometimes at zero stock. And so to have 600 trucks per day now to come in, they will also most likely still be heavily restricted and surveilled by the Israeli military. But it will hopefully alleviate at least a little bit of this starvation and the dehydration and the medical catastrophe that has enveloped Gaza for just even a modicum of that suffering to be alleviated is everything. The staggering amount of unimaginable pain that Palestinians in Gaza have been subjected to by Israel and the United States is something that I think as journalists, as someone who's been committed to this because of Dennis, that this is our life's work, is to keep documenting and to keep a record of what has happened so that it can't be rewritten. And I think that's what we all have to be doing. We all, in any way we can, we have to keep documenting. We have to keep reminding people about this Holocaust. Because the ceasefire is going to be in place, this is just the beginning. The amount of rebuilding that Gaza is going to have to do. And again, it's not, the bulk of it is going to have to be from Gazan ingenuity itself, from people working with what they have to rebuild like they have always done for the last 80 years. The tenacity of refusing to be erased and refusing to be subjected to this torture and this pain, refusing to give up, refusing to surrender is something that is, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with Holocaust literature. I was 12 years old and reading these novels about children in the concentration camps. And, luckily I was born into an anti-Zionist household where there was no revisionism and weaponization of the Nazi Holocaust in order to justify the Holocaust of another people. But I remember vividly soaking those narratives into my bones and becoming so outraged that any of the atrocities that happened by Nazi Germany could have happened for so long, and especially on children, the amount of suffering that the Nazis subjected children to was something that I couldn't ever shake. And I think that kind of, we all have to continue to be shaken up. There's no we can't.
It has to hit you that
It has to hit you that deep. And it has to continue. And, Palestinians deserve the universe. The children deserve the universe. The children, any child, my 2 kids, they're my universe. They're everyone's universe, every child. And to see parents in the last 16 months carrying their children's body parts in plastic bags, that should shake every single one of us.
Absolutely.
I was talking, I don't know if any of you, this is a deep cut, a Nora Barrows-Friedman deep cut, but I don't know if people watch Tanky Group Therapy on YouTube. Great, fantastic. Okay, good. For the last 15 months, my friends and I have gotten together on YouTube, and we call it Tanky Group Therapy, right? So Tanky is like it was the pejorative word for communists. Yeah, someone gets it. So we all call ourselves Tankies, and we have a group therapy session, usually once every couple weeks. And we get together and we are vulnerable and we express ourselves very emotionally about what's happening and how this has irreversibly changed us as human beings. This has affected us on a cellular level that we do not understand yet. This will continue to affect us every day for the rest of our lives, what we've seen the last 16 months. And it's scary to think about that, but it is entirely necessary. We need to have been changed. And figuring out what to do with that energy, with that passion, with that anger, with the grief, I think is the task for all of us. And this is what I'm gonna keep doing, and I know Dennis, you're gonna keep doing it.
Yeah, no choice.
And Bob, and I, this is what we all have to make a commitment to ourselves and each other at this point.
Nora, the thing about the Nazis, that's exactly what changed me forever. I was about 11 when I saw one of these documentaries from, I think, I forget which concentration camp, but the thing that blew my mind is that all the people were made, like right up against the rifle butt.
Yeah.
And those images were impossible. I was never the same.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever was a child again.
Yeah.
Because of seeing the brutality there.
And here we
clearly
see it every day.
Yeah.
We see it every day. The Israelis are attempting to strip every ounce of dignity from Palestinians, and it doesn't work. And we owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves to restore dignity.
Yes.
Listening to you reminded me of something I should have said. I mentioned VVAW, which I think is important because they were on the inside. Folks like you and groups like JPV, I think, serve that function. You know, these are people who, you know, are expected to support whatever Israel does, and they've been so vocal, and they've taken heat, they've taken blows for it, and they've been called anti-Semitic, right?
Yes.
And so, you know, I think folks like you have a special place and a special role, and it's really important, and I really appreciate what you've done because, you know, I always tell people, you know, I'm Sicilian, but I don't support the mafia, right? You know, I enjoy the Godfather movies and things like that, sorry. And so to see what you're doing and to deal with that within your own community, I think is really critical. You know, and it reminds me of groups like VVAW who, you know, were expected to come back and, you know, support the war, and they didn't. And so I think that's a big piece of this too. Amilcar Cabral used to talk about being a class traitor, to do things that aren't expected of you, right? Because, you know, you do the right thing, you choose the right moral path. And so I think you guys are kind of traitors, but, you know, I'm glad for you. So I'm glad, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's, you know, Zionism is not that old.
Right.
Zionism is only about 130 years old, right? And so for me, I feel like Zionists are the traitors. The Zionists are the ones who have weaponized Judaism and turned it into something, as Max Blumenthal said today to Antony Blinken, aligned it with fascism. That's treachery, right? And we have, you know, I mean, I'm a communist. I'm not particularly religious or beholden to Judaism but I'm Jewish, 100% Jewish, and you know, for all intents and purposes, I think I'm expressing my outrage in the best Jewish tradition possible.
And just to, absolutely, you know, and I think if I'm not mistaken, your grandfather was a rabbi?
My great-grandfathers, all of them were Orthodox rabbis, yeah.
And of course, my grandfather, you know, was a rabbi. I mean, a prominent rabbi on the Lower East Side who blessed matzah. His name was on the matzah.
Our families totally knew each other. I'm sure of it.
You know, but I remember my Uncle Leo, the great Leo Pfeffer, who one of the co-founders of the Emergency Civil Liberties Union, having it out with, you know, my mom had 2 brothers and 7 sisters, and Israel was strongly supported. I remember my great uncle, at the time he was the chairman of the political science department at Long Island University, and it's the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They're sitting around talking about Israel. And my Uncle Leo, the great famous lawyer who used to argue on television with William Buckley, says, you know, I don't have to, love everybody in Israel and every politician to be a Jew. At which time, one of my aunts went out one door into the kitchen, came behind my famous uncle, and poured a very big glass of water over his head and said, "End of discussion." And that battle continues, right? And you know, I fought. I had, you know, on Ash Wednesdays when I was growing up, when I was 13 years old, I had 15 fights because they wanted to go after the Christ killers. You know, Bernstein, there he is. He did it. I learned to fight, to protect myself, really in response to that kind of, you know, vicious attack based on, who you are or who you were born as. And here we are. This is it. This is the heart of the matter, right?
And I think there's a lot of conversations happening within Jewish American households. There's definitely a generational divide where, people, 40, I'll say my age, 46 and younger, are, casting off any sort of adherence to Zionism or, loyalty to Israel or anything at the, at the expense of, being nice to their family. I think it's happening. There is a rift happening. There's a generational divide. Zionism is, as I said, it's only been around for a little while. It will not last. We will have a post-Zionist future.
Yes.
And I think that the ones doing most of the work for that are the Palestinian resistance and Palestinian teachers and students and doctors and, proving that Zionism is a settler colonial political ideology and it has nothing to do with Judaism and it should not be a thing anymore. And it doesn't have to be. So yeah, I mean, that's encouraging, right? It's encouraging. Zionism is on its way out.
I think it's also important, like I said, the resistance now is actually fairly significant and large, whereas in the early 60s or the early 80s with Central, it was hard to get people out. I mean, I've organized plenty of events with 10 people, right? And so we are ahead in that regard. The repression is probably worse, but we're ahead too. So. Scott, were you going to come up and run a Q&A, or we have a few minutes left for Q&A. So, is there anything either of you wanted to say before that, or if anybody has a question?
Thank you.
Tell Scott. Or
Hey, can you hear me? All right. Before we'll take a couple of questions, and I would appreciate them to be questions. But real quick before we do that, I just want to shout out actually for our panel. And shout out for all of you coming out tonight and the large number of people we actually have watching on live stream tonight. We got over 200 people on live stream.
Wow. Oh, awesome. That's great.
And a couple of quick things is that we were taking donations at the door, but over here on the table is one of our lovely volunteers, Lynn. And if you feel so moved, please give us any more donations. It's helping us cover the cost of the space and everything tonight, so would really appreciate that. And then in the back, we have a table with lots of materials. We have a couple of copies of Bob's books. We have Green and Red Podcast hats. We have a lot of stickers and other books and zines and things like that. Graham, the guy back there against the wall, is the person to talk to about getting any of the swag that we would take donations for.
The goodie you're down.
So I will, kind of start with a couple of questions. I saw Cynthia's hand go up. Were you raising your hand for a question? Yeah, okay.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you, all three of you, but particularly Dennis for his Flashpoints coverage of this ongoing genocide.
Thank you.
Excellent.
What is she?
The class action lawsuit about voting for weapons for Israel.
I just think that any people's action, any grassroots action is crucial now. And I think the more people who are talking to more people and raising the issues however you can, I love being able to support that lawsuit. And I've done it, you probably all are getting bored with it. I've done it so many times. But I really believe in sledgehammer journalism when something important comes up. And so we've covered that from lots of different angles, and it's important because it helps to explain what's going on and give some clarity to folks who might not have the details or know much about what's happening. People are very busy, people are hungry, people are just trying to live. So then there's a lot of people who care a great deal about this who can't take the time out because life is tough and you don't have the time. But if you can get it into the newspaper, if you can get it into local radio, you can get it out. That's boil up, educate.
Yeah, I am really disturbed by the manipulation of verbiage, self-hating Jew. I would like those people who say that to tell me what their name would be for a anti-Nazi German, self-hating German. You know, the words are so well manipulated and used and twisted, and there seems to be no resistance to that ignorance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, the people who say it are usually the loudest, right? And so it seems like a lot of people say that or think that it means anything, but it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, like I think Larry David said it best. He said, you know, I hate myself for a lot of reasons. Being Jewish is the least of them.
Yeah.
Right here.
So I wanted to ask, so assuming we move from a unipolar to a bipolar power dynamic in the world, you know, then we have like American power receding and slowly China and Russia, who are both anti-Israel, you know, pro-Palestine and stuff. Like, so what do you guys see happening there, assuming things happen in that way? You know, how do you see that panning out? You know, how many years until the U.S. will have to sacrifice their unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East? And where does that rank in the priority list of things that are going to have to be sacrificed?
Yeah. I'm just gonna, because Dennis can't hear very well, so I'm just gonna say it a little louder. Where do you see the multipolar world kind of reconfiguration? Let me know if I get this right. In terms of the U.S.'s kind of hegemonic power, and what happens to the U.S.'s hegemonic power when we are careening toward world?
And what do you think, Nora?
Go ahead. You first.
A bipolar world? Is that what we're thinking?
Yeah.
Are you asking the impact of the policy?
I was simply asking because we're moving towards a bipolar, potentially, I mean, probably, bipolar power dynamic. So at what point will the protection of Israel have to be sacrificed? Like, at what point do you think, is that on the priority list of, you know, the Straits of Johor, the Crimean Peninsula? Like, are these first and then Israel? Or like, you know, at what point will it, I don't know.
You could stand up.
Yeah, you got it.
I'm sorry, Nora.
So,
Do you want? Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
yeah,
I heard him. Yeah. There are many different kinds of hegemonies, right? And the United States, after World War II, obviously had a massive military and technology and B-52s and nuclear weapons and all that. But the main thrust of American power was actually like the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank and programs like that. I mean, they intervened all over the world. It wasn't like they were pacifists or anything like that. But those financial and commercial kind of compacts really, I think, were the basis for American hegemony. Well, that's already gone. And China had a $1 trillion trade surplus last year, right? So the United States doesn't have. So I keep going back, and you know, I always litter what I say with historical references because, like, I'm kind of when I got my PhD, I was obligated to do that, right, as a historian. But the Italian right had a concept they called, I think it was constant friction or constant tension. And I think that's what the United States is doing right now. They try to turn everything into kind of a military conflict because that's where its power lies, right? They have 11 carriers, I believe, or I don't know, 20-some carriers, and China has one, I believe. The United States has 800-some bases. China has one, I believe, or something like that, right? But economically, in terms of production, in terms of infrastructure, obviously China, I mean, go on any subway in any big city and then just Google, the subways in Shanghai and Beijing, and you'll see one looks like it's from 1890 and the other one obviously is modern. And so what does it, I mean, obviously the United States isn't going to have, which is why, it's making an issue of Taiwan, even though there are international agreements on Taiwan. China controls, I mean, it's a one China policy, right? So, that's changing, absolutely. Will the U.S. provoke it to the point of a conflict? I mean, obviously we hope not, but you never know. With regard to Israel, I don't see a circumstance where the United States would leave, would not. Israel, I mean, there's a lot of a debate, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, about why the U.S. supports Israel so much, right? And you have Mir Shamarwal to talk about the AIPAC and the Israeli lobby, which is obviously very important. But I think it's different. I think Israel is what a good friend of Scott and mine, Clinton Fernandez, a scholar from Australia, calls a sub-imperial power. Israel is vital in the region, right? I mean, if it were simply based on pressure here at home or campaign donations, then, I think the United States would have a different kind of policy. Aren't there more Arabs in the United States than Jewish people? And, so it's more than just AIPAC, right? The United States has this role to play, and Israel is kind of what Chomsky used to call the gendarme, the cop on the beat. It's taking care of American interests in that region. And people like Nixon and Biden actually have been quite open about that. If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it because it's taking care of our job, right? When the United States tried to go it alone, like in 1991 and especially in 2003, it didn't go very well, right? And so you give Israel this insane amount of money, right, to go into that region to pacify, Palestine at first. But even more important, I mean, Palestine, I think to American policymakers, is kind of a sideshow. What really matters is Iran, especially Lebanon, Syria. And, I don't know what the ceasefire means. I'm a pessimist by heart. I think in a month, it's not going to look like it does now, right? But, I think there's clearly a waning of American power. But we've been saying this for a long time. But, especially in the aftermath of COVID, the United States in many ways is stronger than it had been. So, the military hegemony isn't going away soon. Economic hegemony, I think, is gone, right? And I think we have to figure out and be prepared to have something in place when that crack up occurs, and it will, right? But I think that, the world is clearly changing. We have a different dynamic. I don't think Trump is an isolationist or a pacifist or anything like that. There may be ways to use his narcissism and vanity against him, I think part of it is Biden supports the war and, supports Israel, so I'm not gonna because Biden did. That may be the way to go, but I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. Freud couldn't figure Trump out, so. But I do think we're clearly moving away, obviously, from American hegemony. Our standards of living and things like that. And militarily, no, I don't think that's imminent. I don't think the dollar is going to cease being the global currency anytime soon. I know there are a lot of people, lefties, who always talk about that and ask me about it, and I'm not in any way convinced that's going to happen anytime, probably in my lifetime, right? Unless some big crack up occurs. One thing, this is kind of off topic, but not really. The fires right now, right? And climate change, right? And one of the reasons we've had the fires, based on what I've read, is that, we've removed that barrier between nature and humans and cities and things like that. Well, I think that's the way COVID happened, right? And there are way more COVIDs out there. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I read like Mike Wallace and Mike Davis and, Rob Wallace and Mike Davis and people like that. And that's had a huge impact in changing the world, right? And I think another one of those is around the corner. And so I think that really also kind of figures into this, because we are going to have, in 10, 20 years, the world's going to look different, absolutely. And I mean, it's China's century, and whether you like it or not, And kind of like you, I actually, when people call me a tanky, I say thanks. I'm okay with
exactly.
that.
It's great.
Yeah. But it's funny. I'm not a Maoist. I'm certainly not RCP. But when people say China's this and China's that, China's a surveillance state. Well, that's true. But you know, like, so are we.
like-
So it's kind of
Call
hard
is coming
for me
from
to
inside
take,
the
you know.
house, yeah.
What's that?
The call is coming from inside the
Yeah,
house.
exactly.
You can't-
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I think that the world has changed. I mean, I think it's already changed, you know, and that's not to say that the United States isn't powerful, and it certainly can inflict immense damage on the world. And we're seeing that in all over, right? Ukraine and Russia and obviously in Israel. But, and I think that's kind of the way it's going to go. It's this constant friction, keep the world in a mess, you know, keep it disencumbered, and then American power can come in and, you know, save the day, which means it's going to kill a lot of people and destroy a lot of land, you know. And when you were talking about Gaza, I thought of Vietnam, where, you know, there are still parts of Vietnam where the water isn't drinkable. There are still, I don't know how many orphanages in Vietnam for children who were exposed to dioxin and are born without brain, you know, with encephalopathy or without limbs or something like that. And I shudder to think of what Gaza will look like and what kind of reconstruction has been done. Last thing I'll say, and this is the part that I don't like, the U.S. kind of won the Vietnam War. I mean, if you look at Vietnam, right? Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Kentucky Fried Chicken, massive American investments, trade deals, you name it, right? I think if Lyndon Johnson were alive, he'd look at that and say, you know, hot damn, we won that war. And I think, you know, we shouldn't downplay how much damage and how much power the U.S. has too, right? But I do think you're right. We're definitely moving away from the world that we've known since, you know, at least World War II. And it'll be interesting time. But I don't think Israel's in any danger of being cut off. They're you know, they're like the rich kid's son who cracks his car up and has to go to rehab and everything, and daddy takes him back and, you know, gives him another check and all that kind of stuff.
But it might collapse internally.
You know, yeah, I can't speak to
officially,
that,
which
but
is
I thought it was interesting.
yeah.
The first flash poll, I mean, a huge majority of Israelis supported, you know.
Oh,
and I think
like 96%.
I would assume
yeah.
they've been holding it in.
Yeah.
You know, because they're afraid to say that, and now it's out. And, you know, in many ways, you probably can't put that back in the bottle, right? So they're going to have to do something different. They're going to have to follow through to some degree with this, right?
And a lot of people are leaving, and their economy is crumbling. We had on Shir Hever today on the live stream, and you should all check out his work. He's amazing. He's a former Israeli. He renounced his Israeli citizenship and lives in Germany, which is, you know, his right of return because his family was from Germany. And so... But he's a political economist, an analyst, and he, you know, talked today about how the Israeli economy cannot recover. They funded this genocide on debt, and in the past, you know, 15 months, their tech sector, right, Silicon Wadi or Startup Nation, whatever, completely gone. Those businesses are not coming back. And it's left this chasm in especially the middle class in Israel, which is, you know, the engine of their economic viability. And their military is very close to mutiny. And they're a pariah. So it's going to be interesting. It might
What
it
do
might
they
collapse
grow in
before-
Israel?
What do they grow?
Yeah.
Violence and terrorism.
I love being straight, man.
I mean,
I think there's somebody out there. way out
As
there.
I think.
Hi, we're talking about the role of the alternative media, right?
Speak up, please.
We're talking about the alternative media, right, and what you guys can do. And something you can do, and it's been touched on, is the mainstream media, the capitalist media, doesn't talk about BRICS. They don't talk about things like Indonesia joining BRICS last week. They're not going to bring that stuff up. And the alternative media has to. People like Michael Hudson, for instance, are great people to analyze this, and Richard Wolff. What I want to say, especially about people who are disappointing, like Democracy Now!, who, for the whole special military operation, where Russia has been fighting against NATO expansion, that's what that war is. She's had it completely backwards. Mm-hmm. And I think righteous people in the alternative media need to speak up. They need to say that the way forward in the world is cooperation, not hegemony. The way forward in the world is BRICS, not the United States. And because people are brainwashed, including leftists. So to me, the left-wing alternative media, your job is tell the people the truth about what's going on in the world. And yes, I'm sorry, Trotskyites, there's bad guys and there's good guys. We're the bad guys. The people fighting us are the good guys. That's the way the world is. And I want to join the tanky group.
Okay, yeah, just search. It's a closed group for now, but anyone can watch it.
Yeah, we got one more here.
We have time for one more, and you've asked one, so I'm wondering if there's anyone who hasn't asked one.
I just have a quick statement.
Well, actually,
Yes.
No one listens.
You need to share this and tell everybody about it, you know?
Here, look at
I know.
doesn't do any good.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. Oh, okay. I just want to use this opportunity to draw attention to somebody right here locally that just pled guilty and is probably going to do 5 to 10 years for charges targeting law enforcement after the crackdowns on the Palestinian encampments last year. And I bring this up partially to poke at what I know is going to be a contentious issue here, but it's interesting to me that we talk so much about our support and our accompaniment for international struggles that use armed resistance as part of their struggle, right? And we don't seem to have the moral qualms about supporting Rojava, supporting Palestinian armed resistance, right? Highlighting the Viet Cong, right? These are all groups that needed more than just people to defeat fascism, right? And I think it's important to think about as we enter the next 4 years, what it's going to take to defeat fascism. And my impression is that we're much more willing to support people who engage in what I would call justified violence, self-defense, when it's international and not when it's here at home. And we have somebody right here in our backyard that if it's a discussion about strategy, I think that's a different conversation, right? Because I don't necessarily agree with the strategy in this case. But if it's a discussion about we can't support violence, I think I'm getting tired of that conversation. I think we need to talk about when violence is justified, when self-defense is justified, and we need to offer strong support for people regardless of whether we agree with their strategies, if they're fighting for a cause that we believe in, right here at home, just like we would if we were supporting people internationally. The person's name's Casey Goonan. They just pled guilty to charges last week. And I guess my question is this feeling right? Do you feel like we are more able to vocally support armed resistance outside of this country? And what is the media's role in kind of demonizing anything that's not peaceful protest in this country, and even independent media, even leftist media, right? What's it going to take to be able to have conversations in this country? You know, does independent media have an ability to advocate for things that are that illegal, potentially, as we enter the next 4 years? Or is that asking too much of independent media because they're just going to get shut down?
Can I ask you, Liz, do you ever watch the Electronic Intifada?
I haven't.
I recommend it. The second hour. It's usually the second hour. To learn more about resistance and the way people are thinking about that.
I think there's been, like on the campus protest, there's actually, I've seen at least significant support work for that. But to your point, I think we need to discuss everything. And I go back to, like, Luigi's a hero, and I'm, this is a random act, I guess, but, and I'm not suggesting, I mean, the problem with violence is that, they have drones and nuclear weapons and stuff like that, so I think from a practical point of view, but no, people who are in jail, yeah, we should support them for these protests, absolutely. Yeah, it's probably easier to support groups abroad because it's because they're abroad, right? They're not in the United States, and we haven't been inculcated in the same way. But I also think, you know, in the next 4 years, I'm not happy to say this. I think it's going to get ugly. I think the streets are going to be very ugly. And not really, I mean, well, obviously the cops, but these paramilitary groups that Trump is unleashing as well. Yeah. And I think people are going to have to decide, like I said, you know, you have to kind of make this decision. You want to be Hugh Thompson or whatever, but, and people are going to have to decide because it's always dangerous, right? But, you know, I think it's going to be more so. And so people are going to have to decide what they're going to do. But I mean, a frontal assault against the state is just going to get everybody killed, you know. But I think, you know, having discussions about different ways to approach things, I think, I keep going back. I use the word fear. I'd rather not, but I use that. I mean, and you can instill fear in people without violence, you know, and Luigi's instilled fear. I mean, the day after Luigi did that, Blue Cross Blue Shield repealed something about anesthetics, and then in North Carolina, 12,000 people were like put back on their insurance. I mean, the ruling class, keep in mind, the ruling class, they're big. The ruling class is scared. You know, and in Trump's first term, we could count on a lot of them. You know, Bezos and, you know, Zuckerberg and other, to, you know, at least allow us a voice. That's not there anymore. They've all capitulated. So, you know, I think you're right about this, but, you know, I think we do talk about Indonesia and we do talk about Ukraine. And I mean, I've been called a Putin lover many times, and, you know, I'm not a trot, but I'm not a Putin lover. I think it's monstrous. I think NATO was a precipitant of the war, absolutely, but I also think he invaded a country in violation of international law. But, you know, neither here nor there. We oppose the war, and we should. And that's the point. You know, you don't have to be pure. You don't have to agree with everything, right? You don't have to agree with Hamas. Doesn't matter. I don't have any problem with what they're doing. You know, I think international law allows what they're doing, but it doesn't matter. You know, we have to support the resistance. I agree with that, but it doesn't mean the Kremlin to me, but.
Yeah. So I want to just sort of circle back in this way, Nora. I want to ask you a question. We've heard many times now, people look at the fires down south, and they say, that looks just like Gaza. Mm-hmm. Sort of, I guess, but the people fleeing down south aren't being shot at, bombed, you know, slaughtered in tents because their houses have already been bombed to dust, right? What do you think when you hear that? And it's suffering. Right. But just add on what's happening to the people. You know, we start the fires, then we kill the people when we're running from the, you know.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think people in the West have been conditioned to think that what happens in Gaza is kind of a natural disaster. And that's how politicians talk about it. They talk about a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, or a famine in Gaza, as though like the potatoes aren't growing and haven't had rain for a long time. This is all engineered, and we know the names of those who have engineered this crisis. This is a genocide. This is a Holocaust. Yes, I mean when I hear people, you know, compare, and I mean I get it. Like the devastation in Gaza looks like a devastated neighborhood, because it is, you know, whether by fire or airstrikes. Every single one of those houses was a family, was a generation, was belongings, was, you know, heirlooms, was a community. But the, you know, I think it's this. Yeah, I've been trying to actually figure out how to articulate why it kind of makes me cringe so much. I mean, I heard like Jamie Lee Curtis say, "Oh yeah, you know, she lost one of her like 3 homes or whatever in the Pacific Palisades, which, you know, those houses are like $10 million at a bottom price. You know, that's where like all the A-list celebrities and bankers and, you know, politicians live in LA." And she said, "Oh yeah, the devastation, it looked something like, I don't know, Gaza or something, as though Gaza is just supposed to look like this, like what it looks like right now. And people like Jamie Lee Curtis, who shared on her social media, how much she supports Israel at the very beginning of this Holocaust. So this, and it's not like the fires in LA were 100% a natural disaster either. It's climate crisis. It's the loss of and privatization of infrastructure. It's deliberate, allocation of resources and privatization of those energy companies, and allocation of resources to police instead of fire brigades and firefighters themselves, and the use of incarcerated people to fight the fires in place of an actual structure for fire abatement, and the fact that this state, California, just 2 months ago, decided to keep slavery as a policy for incarcerated people. The word slavery was in the bill that everyone voted on, and people in California overwhelmingly voted to keep slavery as a state policy, and the use of, I think it was like 30 juvenile incarcerated kids who were fighting the fires in LA. All of these, it's just this huge convergence of all of these like sounding the alarm bells for all the things that we fight against. We fight against capitalism and incarceration and corporate, oligarchy and settler colonialism, and the fact that, I don't know, back in the 1920s, rich people in LA bribed city council members in order to build and expand these massive homes in a place like Pacific Palisades and in Malibu, which everybody knew was fire prone, and which were not meant for people to put these, gigantic houses on at the expense of the natural world, at the expense of the indigenous land that it's on, where indigenous communities have stewarded that land for millennia, and have said this is a way to keep fires from spreading, and nobody listened, and people kept building, and people kept stealing the resources. And so all of this, none of it is a natural disaster. What's happened in Gaza is a crime, and to kind of like absolve those who committed the crimes, whether it's in Gaza or in Los Angeles, is very dangerous.
I think we're close now. I want to leave with just a little vignette, which I suspect many of you know already. I got it from Alex Coburn. When Lenin was exiled in Zurich, a young radical went up to him, and he was very concerned because he wasn't doing enough for the cause. He wasn't, an adequate revolutionary. And Lenin told him, "Be as radical as reality itself." So.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's great.
So I'm going to wrap it at that. I want to thank the panel. And thank the Berkeley Fellowship of Unitarian Universalists and everyone who helped put this whole thing together.
Like my new glass.
And
Very cute.
I think we'll close it at that. Check out Flashpoints on KPFA. Check out Electronic Intifada on the internet. Check out Green and Red Podcasts on the internet. And everyone have a good night. Oh.
Before we leave, give this guy a standing ovation because he put it all together. He did it all.
All right, and check out the swag back in the back.
Stupid check myself. I don't